Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the ConTinual panel room. Today, we're discussing World War II in fiction. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and we'll start with the panel introducing themselves and telling everybody a little bit about their interest in the Second World War. Pam, do you want to start?
Thank you. Well, I'm Pam Lecky. I'm based in Dublin, Ireland, and I'm a hybrid author. I publish World War II series with Avon Books UK and HarperCollins, and I self-publish Victorian mysteries as well. I suppose I've always been interested in world wars, and invariably, much to my children's horror, any movies or documentaries that involve either World War I or II, I'm usually plumped right in front of it. So that has made me incredibly popular in my house. I suppose my interest in history overall dates back to when I was quite young. My father was a very avid reader and encouraged me to read too. And his love of history probably seeped into my consciousness at some stage. And I read a lot of historical fiction growing up. And I suppose it was only natural when I did begin to write that I'd kind of veer towards that. So I suppose when I was asked by my agent to write a World War II novel, I was actually quite hesitant because there is quite a lot of World War II fiction out there, and I was struggling to see what unique angle I could bring to the stories. But the more I thought about it, I just felt, well, actually the Irish angle isn't explored a lot in World War II fiction. So I thought, well, that's the way I will go. So that's probably where I started the whole process and planning and plotting. I read extensively. I would have known a lot about, this was the overall picture of World War II, but it was the nitty gritty details of life, particularly in Britain and on the home front, because my books are set in the UK. That I had to do a lot of reading and research, and I was very lucky to come across some very helpful resources and websites. And so that's it. So I've published two World War II books. The second will be out shortly. And that's kind of my journey so far.
Okay. Suze?
Well, I'm Suzanne Ferrell, and I write romantic suspense books. Generally, a dead body pops up in every book somewhere along the line.
Yay!
Yay! And well, that helps when things slow down. You go, ooh, time for a dead body. When I was writing my Edgar's books, a friend approached me about writing a pirate book. And I thought, I don't write pirate books. And then I kind of thought about it a while and thought, well, what if I set it as a prequel to my Edgar's books? And I have my hero pretending to be a pirate to stop smugglers, which then morphed into what if he was pretending to be a smuggler to look for spies, because this was going to be the grandfather to my characters in my contemporary series. And I've always loved World War II, the history of it, and how the United States came to be part of it, and how the Allies worked together. There was a recent National Geographic magazine that talked about all the spies that were in the United throughout. Mostly in the United States. They did the Duskany group, and they did a few of the others. And I got to tell you, I never saw so many incompetent spies in my life as the people that were spies in America in World War II. I mean, they were pretty much caught from the beginning. They really were like, why would you do that? And it just kind of piqued my interest. And then as I did research, I discovered a lot of other things. So kind of taking the intrigue part and using that as a way to tell the stories of these five guys that work for the ON, the Office of Naval Intelligence, which was the precursor to the NCIS. And so it was kind of fun to set up that group. And that's kind of where I am with it. I'm on book 2 of a 5-book series.
Sophia?
I'm Sophia Nash. I write for HarperCollins, published in some countries, including the US. I've been fascinated by World War II, I think because I'm French and American, and both my French family and my American family fought during World War II. My father is the American, and he fought under Patton. He marched across Europe and ended up in Germany. And then my grandfather as well, he was a spy for the French resistance in the south of France on the Atlantic coast. And there were several really hair-raising scenarios that happened during their lives that I got to hear about when I was growing up. And I've always been fascinated by it, as well as World War I, where I have French ancestors who were involved. So that was the seed that grew a vast desire to know more about that period of history. And my current work in progress is the first book which I'm writing about World War II. It's a prequel to Whispering in French, my last book.
Okay, Jeannie?
Well, I am fascinated with it because my father served in World War II. He was a much older parent, and so he served in World War II as a medic. He was a conscientious objector. He didn't mind carrying a gun, but he wouldn't shoot it at people. So they stuck him in the medical corps. And he was part of Patton's army, much like Sophia's dad. And he was in the back end, of course, because he was in the medical corps. And he was part of the D-Day invasion in that he was one of the soldiers who was brought into the UK and billeted with families. And they were billeted with families and didn't build barracks so that the Germans wouldn't know how many US soldiers were already in the UK. So it became a part of my childhood and my life because the young man with whose family he was billeted, his name was Ken Russell, Dr. Ken Russell, he was too young to serve, but he and my father remained friends for their entire lives. So Ken would come over to the US to see us. And so that was the only time my father would tell stories about his experiences in the war. And after his death, we found a scrapbook with all of these pictures of all of these places he had been, with handwritten notes and things from my grandmother where she had written to Ken Russell's mother, and Ken Russell's mother had written back, and they would always start with the young gentleman of our mutual acquaintance is fine, because they couldn't name names or they'd get stuck by the censors. So that started the fascination, and it's such a cauldron of conflict, and there's so much, there's so many untold stories there that it's just a fascinating era in history. And it's modern enough that there are modern things and people in our generation can relate to them, and historical enough that we can do all kinds of fun things with it. So,
well, my dad and my mother served in the US Navy during the Second World War. And so I grew up hearing a little bit about that. My mother actually talked more about her experiences. She was a dispersing officer, excuse me, than my dad did, because he grew up in the Philippines and was captured on Corregidor when the Germans invaded. So he spent much of the war as a prisoner of war, most of it in Japan. And he didn't share a lot of that with his children. But my mom would talk about some of the experiences that she had had on various bases. And if there was a World War II movie on TV, if there was a World War II TV show, we watched it. There was this show called The Silent Service that was about the submarine service. And I think it must have been a pretty old show because it was on Sunday afternoon, back before there was football everywhere and TV stations needed something to show. And all I remember about it is this footage of a submarine surfacing and the water sluicing off the deck as it breaks the surface. That's all I remember. But we saw every John Wayne movie about World War II. The last movie that my dad and I saw together a couple of years before he died was Saving Private Ryan. His interest was mostly the war in the Pacific. I'm mostly interested in the war in Europe. I think partly because maybe reading about the war in the Pacific kind of hits close to home because I think about him when I read about that. But one of the things that interests me about the war is that there were so many points at which it so easily could have gone the other way.
Oh, yes.
And so I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I'm also a hybrid author. I independently published some fiction, one series of science fiction with Jeanne, as a matter of fact. And my historical fantasy trilogy for Falstaff takes place in 3 different time periods. And when I had to choose the period for the 3rd book, it was just natural for me to choose the early days of the Second World War. And it was interesting to me to do the research because life in the UK at that point, even before the shooting started, or the shooting started on full scale, was very different from life here. And so that research was really educational and interesting, and in some ways surprising. So why don't we get into a discussion of our books and other things that we like about the period? Why did you decide to use it as a setting for fiction? Is there anything you want to add to what you've already said? Suze, do you want to start?
Well, it's like I said, it was a prequel and it was grandparents. So I set it at the age of what my parents would have been. My parents were latecomers. They were teenagers during World War II, but they had older siblings that served. And it leads to a lot of intrigue. I love to be able to do intrigue with the books. Yeah.
Let me clarify my question, because
Okay,
I just realized listening to you answer it that really I was basically asking you all to say what you've already said. So what about the particular incidents in the war that you find outstanding when you think about it, that really draw your attention and that you gravitate to? Did you draw inspiration from for your books?
The women in the wars, you don't really hear about women in their efforts during the war. The 3rd book in this series, I'm actually going to make the heroine a nurse. There's a fabulous book I read called If I Should Perish. It's a true life story of the women that served in the American Army, and they start a course in Africa. I always feel like you see the men going off to war and you don't see what the women do in the background. And I've also read a lot about the SOE spies in France, the women that served. And just finished a book called The Resistance Women, which takes place in Germany. And there's 3 real life people. It doesn't end well for some of the people in the book, and how they try to go behind and try and stop the Nazi movement with not much success at the time. But I think taking women and putting them in a place where they can be just as heroic in their own way, it really spoke to me. And of course I write romantic suspense, so being able to have them work together. And my newest book, Tracked, I have a heroine is a code breaker. And there's a lovely series of different books about the women that worked as code breakers in the United States. At the same time Bletchley Park was going on, they were working for both the Navy and the Army. And of course, the Navy and the Army never talked to each other, so they were always, it was like competitive code breaking going on. And I had her bring this message she got received from her brother, I made him a spy in Germany, because why not? And he sends her a message that his twin brother is on Patton's group of people, army division, his tank division, and that they're going to sabotage it. And so she tries to go up her chain of command with the army, and they don't want to talk to her for reasons. So she goes to my Navy spy people, and they take on the assignment. So that's how they end up in it. And so this little group they're fascinating. They're all 5 different guys from 5 different places. And then there's my one character that we can't put on here because he does cuss every sentence. There's a cuss word in every sentence. He can't do it. It's like habit with him. It's like a second language, you know. He's from Boston. What do you expect?
And all the Bostoners viewing this go, really? Sophia, what about you?
So the book I'm writing right now, it's an exploration of, it's 3 women, and it's during wartime, World War I and World War II. And it really examines where our loyalties lie. Are they with our friends, our family, our country? Can it be all or not? And there was an incident in my family, which happened well before I was born, that always fascinated me. And that it happened in France, in Southwest France, in Biarritz. And my grandfather was married and got divorced. And then his second wife was an English woman. And his father highly disapproved of any idea of divorce. And so he never accepted the second wife. And this all happened during the war. And so women and children were sent inland away from the occupied zone to Pau, P-A-U. And his second wife was never allowed to meet the father-in-law or mother-in-law. And my great-grandfather died due to prolonged effect of mustard gas poisoning during World War I. And when he died, she finally came into Biarritz with the children, with her husband, with my grandfather, and they attended the funeral. And afterwards, they all had lunch at the house, and they heard the drone of planes. And so they all went outside onto the balcony, which overlooked the ocean. She's British, my grandfather's French. And the one and only bombing raid by the British flew in that day to bomb the railroad tracks in Biarritz. And one bomber, for some reason, didn't discharge a bomb. And so he was lightening his load before flying back to England and dropped it, tried to make the ocean, but hit the house instead and killed his second wife. And also he had scars on his face because of it. Also killed the cook. And to me, that was just absolute. I mean, the irony, the bizarre happenstance of life with no rhyme or reason. But, you know, first she was killed by her own countrymen, and she was there to honor the memory of her father-in-law she never met. And I mean, the entire thing was fascinating. My grandfather, apparently the week before, had been dug into the sand to deliver a message to a spy on a beach. So, I mean, all of these stories just fascinate me and led to me writing the current work in progress, which includes this incident. And I actually mention it in the last book as well. So.
Hey, Jeannie.
Oh gosh. What sort of led me to it was I had read long before Indiana Jones came out, I had read that about the whole business about Hitler being fascinated with the occult and collecting items of occult nature. And, you know, when I started to write this book, which is a paranormal romantic suspense, I thought, you know, I better go back and check that. And sure enough, He did. He collected a lot of things that that had some sort of provenance that might be mystical or that sort of thing. And he was always looking for something that might give him an edge or a, magic. And so my story, which is called Behind Enemy Lines, features an item that is purported to be magic and help you figure out who you should be married to. And it's of course fiction, but I have Hitler wanting it because he wants to, propel the Aryan race to great things. So, of course, they want to keep it out of his hands for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is, eugenics not so good. And that was part of it. And then also reading about, like Suze was saying, a lot of the women who were behind the scenes and behind the lines, both in Germany and especially in France, as Sophia was mentioning, a huge number of the French resistance were women. And they are sort of unsung heroes in many ways. And there were a lot of spies in the English aristocracy who happened to be in France. Now, my story is set in 1939 and 1940, just as things were sort of getting hairy and Germany was invading Poland, and they started, messing around, crossing the borders into France as well. And so part of it is sort of a chase story trying to get out of France before the Nazis invade. And so and then of course they get stuck behind enemy lines, a la the title. So that interest is kind of what piqued the story.
Pam?
Well, I suppose for me, looking for an Irish angle, one of the most famous incidents in World War II was the bombing by the Luftwaffe of Dublin. Now it happened in May 1941, and there were 4 bombs dropped on the city, one which caused huge devastation in an area called North Strand. And as it happened, I grew up just a few miles away from that place. I never knew about this incident until I was probably in my teens, and then became quite fascinated by it. So when I was plotting my book, I thought, this could be a great opening for my book. So my book does open with this particular incident. And my protagonist, her house is bombed and she loses family in the incident. And her boyfriend at the same time has declared he's going to enlist with the RAF, and he goes off to England. So she's kind of left wanting revenge, but she knows, because Ireland was neutral, that there wasn't really anything she could do at home in Ireland. So when she's offered a home with her uncle and aunt in England, she moves there and takes up a job at Supermarine, which is the company who designed and made the Spitfire. Unfortunately, when she's there, she gets mixed up with MI5, and her loyalties are tested, particularly with, I suppose, the British attitude to Irish people at the time was not great, because the Irish were insistent on being neutral. So there is a lot of that kind of tension, and I wanted to explore that as well in the book. I suppose, like yourselves, for me, I had family involved in World War II. My uncle actually did enlist with the RAF. He had the lovely job of loading bombs onto Lancasters. And he used to always scare us with the story where one day they were loading a bomb and it rolled back down onto the concourse, and they all just froze because, as my uncle said, there was no point in running. If it was going to go off, we were dead anyway. But I don't know what happened, but it didn't explode, so he was okay. But the interesting thing for me was that my mother and her sisters grew up in rural Ireland on the west coast. You couldn't have found probably a safer place during World War II, but what did the 3 of them do? They up sticks and go to England to work. So my aunt worked in a munitions factory in Birmingham. My other aunt decided she was going to train as a nurse. And my mother got a job as a bus conductress on the buses. So she was what was known as a clippy. So I suppose my book, Her Secret War, isn't about them, but there's kind of little nuggets of their lives throughout the books. So I suppose when you have that kind of connection, it makes the book easier to write, I think. You know, it's kind of, you own it more, nearly. So, yeah, so I think probably most people who write World War II fiction have these kind of connections, family connections. It's still living memory. It's still, you can remember a grandfather or an uncle talking about the war. So I think that's what makes it kind of special too.
Well, I've always been interested in the Dunkirk evacuation because it was just such a close shave. And then that flows right into the Battle of Britain, which also was a really close shave. And I read a book about the Battle of Britain years and years ago. And the thing that sticks out in my mind about it was that Churchill was at one of the air bases with Dowding, who was then the head of Fighter Command. And they had those little tables. You've seen them in movies where they have the little icons, figures representing different military units, and they're pushing them around with those long rake-like things. And so they're watching this flood of German bombers come across the channel. And Churchill says to Dowding, why don't you throw in the reserves? Why don't you call up the reserves? And Dowding just looked at him and said, sir, there are no reserves. That was it. And so when I was looking at the Second World War, I knew I wanted to start with the Dunkirk evacuation. And conveniently for me, it rolls right into the Battle of Britain. When I was first reading about the Dunkirk evacuation, all I knew about it was what you always hear in school, that the British Army was trapped on the beaches at Dunkirk and the Royal Navy and all these civilian ships came over and took them off. And it sounds like it was all very upbeat. And, you know, yes, it was a close call. And yes, the Germans were bombing and shelling and all that fun stuff. But everything was orderly and everything went well. And then when you start reading the actual histories of it, you understand why Churchill said wars are not won by evacuations, because they had Navy shore parties on the beach to keep people in their queues, to keep people from jumping the line, because naturally people were scared. You're literally fishing a barrel on that beach until somebody comes to take you off. And so I started with that, and then the Battle of Britain is kind of background to the rest of it. But a long time ago, I read a biography of Margaret Burke-White, who was a female photojournalist who covered the war. And so when I needed a heroine, I wanted her to be an American, because all the other characters in the lead characters in the series were British, not unnaturally, since one book takes place in the 1670s and the other takes place during the Napoleonic Wars. And I don't have French ancestors, so I didn't have anything to draw on to do a French character in that book. So she's the heroine's an American photojournalist, and the hero is a British Army officer injured doing reconnaissance in Czechoslovakia after the Germans moved in. So the book ends with the Blitz. And one of the things that's always stuck in my head about that period, aside from that incident at Fighter Command, was that the RAF was on the ropes in August and September. I mean, in August, the Luftwaffe threw everything it could. It was called Adlertag. That's probably the wrong pronunciation, but it translates to Eagle Day. Threw everything they had at the RAF, trying to wipe out the RAF and the airfields to clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, where they already had boats massed on the coast of France. And the RAF beat them back. But even though the losses were much greater for the Germans than the RAF, the Germans had more they could afford to lose. At one point, the factories were turning out planes in Britain faster than the RAF could train pilots. So the RAF won the day on Eagle Day, but they still were not in shape to repulse another massive invasion, or at least not according to the books that I read. And so at that point, for some reason, Hitler decided to concentrate on bombing the cities instead. And that became the Blitz. And it gave the RAF a chance to rebuild their resources, train more pilots, prepare for the defense of the kingdom. And so all that just naturally, the timing's really convenient for me because it's boom, 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 Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, Blitz. But it also let me pull in 3 things in history that I've always found just really fascinating. And so writing my photojournalist was fun. My husband has a colleague who's actually interested in the history of photography. And so I emailed him and said, what kind of cameras is my heroine going to carry? I've been having trouble finding that out. And here came this list. She would carry
and they're German cameras.
they're
That's
German
the irony.
cameras. Excuse me. So that was really handy. But then we got into she's on the beach with the soldiers waiting to be evacuated, and they had to wade out to the ships because of the way the beach is configured. You can't come up there. They had the mold that we all saw in the movie Dunkirk, if you saw the movie. And so people were boarding from that, but everybody couldn't board from that. And so soldiers were wading through the water. And I thought, okay, she's been in France with the British Expeditionary Force for several months. She has all these canisters of film. Is that film going to survive the wading out to the boat? So that sent me on a rabbit hole quest for finding out how people stored and carried film. And I discovered that, yes, they stored it in tight metal canisters. So probably some of it would have survived the wading. But it's interesting, the rabbit holes you go down when you start researching. Did anybody else go down a rabbit hole when they were working on their books? Sophia, do you want to start?
Oh, yeah.
I was actually just trying to remember, I was going to answer something you had brought up. My father always carried around a Minox camera. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but they're tiny. They're about maybe this big, like maybe like the size of a cigar. And I'm wondering if they used that during World War II, because he had it in the 1950s. And it was an amazing camera because it took tiny, tiny pictures, but very, very clear. But anyway, what was your question?
Well, my question was, did you go down any particular research rabbit holes?
Just off the top of my head, I would say no. But it's so easy, as we know, being writers. I mean, the fascination with research, you can go down a rabbit hole every single day. But I think that's what we all do, right? Is we watch movies and we read books about World War II because we're fascinated, and somehow little bits and pieces sometimes end up in our stories.
Jeannie?
Oh my gosh. So originally the plot of this book involved the King of England. And I was going to have there'd be a kidnap plot, and they were gonna, except that he was already in France on the day that I had him being kidnapped in England. Didn't work out for me, so that had to change the story. So I was in this research rabbit hole for about 2 days, tracking the king's movements during 1939. I'm like, well, wait a minute, what if it was this day in 1930? No, that won't work. So that was one research rabbit hole. And another research rabbit hole has nothing to do with what ended up in the story, because I was looking for explosives. So I ended up down the rabbit hole from actually World War I with the explosion in Halifax, which was the largest man-made explosion prior to Hiroshima at that point. And that was a huge rabbit hole. And I've gone back down that rabbit hole several times, though I have never used that in a story. But yeah, those two were quite extensive rabbit holes. They were rabbit warrens, really.
Pam?
Well, for me, I was fascinated by, as I said before, Supermarine and the whole process of designing planes, and from literally from the beginning to actually somebody testing the planes. I was very, very fortunate. I came across a website called the Supermariners, and it was run by a guy who was just had done so much research. I mean, he literally could send me photographs of the rooms I was using in the story.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I mean, it was brilliant. And one of the things I needed my protagonist to do was to smuggle drawings out. And he helped me. He actually helped me with how, I'm not going to say how she does it, but yeah, it was brilliant. So that particular rabbit hole turned out to be very valuable, not only with my plot, but it also gave me ideas for characters. And, you know, so I never badmouth a rabbit hole. I think they're all brilliant. I always get something from them.
Yeah.
The other rabbit hole that I went down for this book was they're on a Thames tugboat getting ready to go back across the channel. And there were 3 routes across the channel, one of which they couldn't really use once the Germans took Calais because the Germans could shell them. They couldn't use that route during the day. So the heroine says to the captain, well, how long is it going to take? And I thought, why did you have her ask him that? You don't know how long it takes. So I started looking at what kind of boats, how fast do they go? How far is this route? Are they going to have to zigzag? Oh, and I learned this cool little weird fact, which is there was some kind of algae or something like that in the water in the channel that the wakes of the boats kicked up. It was bioluminescent. And so this was before planes could electronically track things on the ground or on the water, but the pilots flying overhead could see the bioluminescence in the wakes of the boats, which stirred it up. You just go to the front end of that and you drop your bomb or you do your strafing. And that was like, whoa. So that was really cool. But then I'm still obsessed with how long is it going to take them to get back to Dover? And I wanted to use Dover because I've been to Dover and I haven't been to Folkestone or Ramsgate or any of those places. So I started all this weird research about what kind of boat would it be, like I said, and how fast does it go? And then I discovered there is actually, like with Pam's situation, a website devoted to the little ships. And so, which for those who don't know is what people call the civilian ships that went over to evacuate Dunkirk, many of which actually had Navy crews, but not all. They commandeered the boats and the captains and owners said, you go do that, that's fine. But some of them actually took their own boats over. So it was fascinating. Then I got fascinated reading all the different accounts because some of the logs are online. And so you could read what the captains experienced. And they say things like fierce shelling. And that's all they'd say, just fierce shelling, or stopped to rescue survivors. And it was so interesting. And so I finally had to go, you know, most of your book takes place after this. Perhaps you should move on and deal with things that are, you know, pertinent to your story. So I did find my answer and I cross-checked it with 3 different boats on that website. And I thought, it's like when I went down a rabbit hole about when did the wall around the Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey come down? Did my character?
Oh Lord, that was a long one. That was a long rabbit hole.
And finally my son came in and he said, Mom, how many people do you think know the answer to that? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe 6. And he said, and how many of those are going to read your book? And I said, it only takes 1. So anyway, we've all been there. But somebody mentioned, I think it might have been Sophia, mentioned movies about the Second World War. What are movies about the war that particularly stand out for you? Jeanne, do you want to start?
Oh gosh, there's so many. The Dirty Dozen, Tora. I mean, like you said earlier, if there was a World War II movie on, we watched it. The Green Berets, although I'm not sure if that one's about World War II. You know, the recent one I watched several times was oh shoot, it's the one with Andrew Garfield, and it's not Heartbreak Ridge, it's Hacksaw Ridge, because he was a conscientious objector, as my father was, and he refused to carry a weapon. Now, my father had a much easier time than that character did because Daddy was like, sure. He got medal, you know, commendation thing is for how fast he could take apart and put together a weapon, but he wouldn't fire it at human. So medical corps, but so that one was really fascinating to me, and I thought it was really, really well done. There have been so many. I mean, Dunkirk was excellent. I know there were some people who had nitpicks with it, but for the most part, my husband's a big World War II buff, and he felt like that most people were nitpicking rather than just enjoying the experience. And on that note, I should probably mention that as a pure act of, wow, I really like this guy, my husband and I went to see Saving Private Ryan twice on dates when we first started dating. And I confess that I sat through the first time like this, because pretty horrific. And, all I could imagine was, gosh, my dad was in this. And as a fact of how much I really do like him, I went a second time. But I think that one's pretty brilliantly made too.
Pam?
Well, pretty much like what Jeannie has said. But there was a recent movie about Churchill, and I cannot remember the name of it. And I thought that was excellent.
The Darkest Hour?
Yes, that's the one. Yes, yeah, I really enjoyed that.
I like that movie too. Suze?
Okay, this one is my favorite, and it's just wrong. Kelly's Heroes.
Oh, I love that one.
I mean, they're not only trying to beat the Nazis, they're trying to steal gold. So I found the book or the movie with the Monument Men. I really like that one. With
Oh, I love that one.
Look for the art, and it brought out. I knew that Hitler had gone for art. I didn't realize that they had gone for that much of it, and that these guys went in. I had no idea these guys went in there to find it. And then I think my favorite action movie for World War II is Midway, the original one with Charlton Heston.
The original one. Yeah,
I think it gave you more a detail of what was going on and how they came at it and how close they were to actually being blown up again, and kind of the luck of the flyers kind of just finding them, and kind of showing off the arrogance of the Japanese that they didn't think the Americans could come back that fast, and the determination of them to come back at them and to kind of go at it with them. There's also a book or a movie that was done had to have been in the 80s, because it was Michael Douglas and Melanie Griffin. It's called
yes.
She comes in and she speaks German, and she's his secretary, and she ends up going undercover as a spy in France. So that's a good movie too. And then of course there's the much beloved, because Harrison Ford is in it, Hanover Street. Just Harrison Ford's in it. Why would you want to not watch it? Watch it every time it comes on. Harrison Ford's in it.
I'm trying to remember the name of that movie, because I loved that movie.
Which one? One with Melanie Griffin?
Yeah.
And Michael Douglas.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
Shining Through.
Yeah.
Shining
Through, that's it. Yeah.
Sophia, what about
Shining Through, yeah.
Well, I just watched one last week that I thought was fascinating with Tom Hanks. It's called Greyhound, and
that's supposed to be really good.
Yeah, it's really good. It's based on a true story. He plays a captain. It's his very first voyage, leading a convoy of ships across the Atlantic, and of course, so it takes place over about a week. And he's, of course, attacked by U-boats a number of times. And it's just beautifully done, really gripping. So I highly recommend that one. And then, of course, the one that we all know, Pearl Harbor, I found beautifully filmed as well and interesting. But there's so many. And then of course, I don't know if you talked about books, but one book stood out for me for what it was like to be in Berlin, and that is In the Garden of Beasts, written by Larson. And it is from the point of view of an American diplomat who's stationed in Berlin. And actually, it's the point of view of his daughter.
Martha Dodds.
Huh?
Martha Dodds.
Yes, exactly. And fascinating book. And then, of course, I haven't finished it, but All the Light We Cannot See. I've got about 5 books right now in World War II. I'm in the middle of, and then also A Gentleman in Moscow. I mean, there are just so many amazing books. But anyway.
Well, the movie that my husband reminded me that we had both liked was The Imitation Game with Alan Turing about, with Benedict Cumberbatch as Alan Turing at Bletchley Park.
It's so heartbreaking though. Oh
yeah,
It's
it's sad. And then when we were kids, there was a movie called Is Paris Burning? And I've never seen it, but apparently Hitler had ordered Paris to be wired with explosives. Sophia, you probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah, he did. And now I can't remember, obviously. So Hitler said when they left, when they were being pushed back, he said, just burn all of Paris. And one of you might remember, I can't remember, but there was a diplomat who basically countermanded him. And so that's the reason why it was not torched to the ground.
Yeah. And so for some reason, when I was thinking about this panel, that movie popped into my head. And we watched one on TV called Defiance. And it's got Daniel Craig and Liev Schreiber, and they're about Jewish partisans in Belarus during the war, doing undercover actions against the Nazis in Western Russia. I have to stop and think north, south, east, west. Western Russia would be closer to the rest of Europe. But Sophia raised an interesting point, which is books. And after all, we're all writers. So let's talk some more about books. Pam, you want to start us?
Well, I suppose for me, I tend to read more nonfiction. So a recent book that I've read it several times, but it's by Tim Tate, and it's Hitler's British Traitors, and it's all about fifth columnists in the UK. It's absolutely fascinating. And it actually, both my books are taken a huge amount from this particular book. So if anyone has an interest in British spies and all of that, it's definitely one to look out for. So yeah, I haven't read a huge amount of World War II fiction. Recently, I'm always afraid that I'll be subconsciously absorbing stuff and churning it out again. So I tend to, the same when I'm writing my Victorian stuff, I tend to lay off the Victorian novels. So yeah, so that's that for me, that, you know, there's some brilliant nonfiction stuff out there, and it's I mean, we'd all be lost without those kind of resources, I think.
Suze?
Like I said, I just recently finished The Resistance Women, and that's how I knew Martha Dodds was the daughter of the diplomat in Berlin, because she plays heavily in that book. It's by, I'm looking up the name of the author, Jennifer Schiaverin, and it's historical fiction, and she takes her and oh gosh, I'm going to forget her name, Mildred. I'm terrible with names. I can't even remember my own character's name sometimes. Who was her and her husband were, she was an American who married a German and was living there. She was an English teacher, and they worked for the resistance. And then there was a lady named Greta, again, can't remember last names, who was, and all three of them were real characters. And then there was a fourth character named Sarah, and she wanted a Jewish girl who was living in Berlin and working for the resistance, and there was a number of them worked for this thing they Germans called it the Red Orchestra, and she couldn't find one that interacted with all three of these, so she sort of made up a character to represent them and how they interplayed there. So that was a really fascinating book. I'm reading The Rose Code, which is a book about three women who work at Bletchley Park. It's a historical fiction, and it takes place while they're in Bletchley Park in 1947, and something happens. I just started the book. Somebody betrays somebody, and something else comes out. And the author of it is, I'm using it to hold up my computer here, Kate Quinn, who wrote the Alice Network, if you haven't read that one.
Yeah.
And Sophia, I don't know if you've read it, but it takes place in World War I and World War II. Most fascinating character. I love really weird characters that are fascinating, was the older woman that's in that book.
She was tortured.
And that's why she, as you go through it, you understand how she comes to be the way she is at the beginning of the book. By the end of the book, you're real sympathetic towards her. So I'm looking forward to this one about the women in Bletchley Park. And I read The Code Breakers, which is about the women that were code breaking in America, along with Elizabeth. Her husband and her started the OSS.
Donovan? Bill
Yes,
Donovan?
thank you. Terrible with last names. I sometimes as a nurse, I remembered everybody's first name, couldn't tell you their last name. It was fascinating to read about that. And then, of course, the women that were served as spies. I've been doing a lot of nonfiction, fiction, historical fiction kind of stuff. Not too many romantic fiction, because again, I don't want it to interfere with what I write. I'm sort of like Pam. If I'm writing my contemporary, I stick to historical. If I'm writing my small town, I stick to more dark romantic suspense. So there is a book I'm looking forward to. I'm going to give her a plug for a very good friend of mine who is her first women's fiction historical, as called The Fly Girls. I believe it's called The Fly Girls. It's coming out in March, and it's by Lorraine Heath. And
excellent.
Well, she's taking her history. Her mother's from England, her father was from Texas, and she grew up in Texas. And the women in Texas that helped train flight, I think that's how it goes. I haven't read anything about it. I'm just looking forward to it because I know it's going to be really good.
Well, if Lorraine wrote it, it will be, yes.
Sophia, what about you?
Yeah, there's one other book I wanted to mention, because I love reading authors who actually lived in the time period. So it's Suite Française. I don't know if any of you have know the story, but it was made into a movie, and it's a brilliant, huge success as a book. But she wrote it. She was Jewish, the woman, and she had to hide, and she was deported to a concentration camp. But she hid the manuscript before she left, and it was found by, I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say her granddaughter or a relative, a niece, in a closet in a briefcase. And so it was published after her death, obviously, but it's one of the most beautiful stories, and it really gives you a feel. She loved description. So anybody looking for realistic description of what it was like to live during World War II in France, it's that book. Yeah, so that was one I wanted to mention. I mean, there's so many. Also, that Bletchley Park book, I've read it, and it's fantastic. There's also a ton. The other thing is, if anybody is near London, and I know Jeannie and I went, I believe, the Imperial War Museum has the most incredible exhibits, and they actually put up, what was the name of that corrugated iron shelter that the people in London used during the Blitz?
Anderson shelters.
Yeah, so they actually have one there, and they have, so many things of the time period. Again, you can see it and feel it and understand it a lot better up close.
Jeanne?
The planes are super cool too, though.
Yeah.
Pam, you were talking about the planes. Seeing the planes in the Imperial War Museum, you get such a sense of, wow, that's a very frail thing to be carrying that many bombs.
Yeah. And the
Um,
bombs. Do you remember the bombs
yeah.
themselves were there too?
Huge. Yeah. And you think, wow, that plane had to fly really fast. Books. I just am starting Sisters of the Resistance by Christine Wells, which is awesome. It's about the Paris fashion houses and how they helped the underground. Same thing with Stephanie Drey's The Women of, what's the name of it? House Lafayette. And they too are part of that. I wanted to go back and mention a couple movies though that are World War II movies that I absolutely loved. One of them is Mr. Roberts, and the other one is Operation Petticoat. I watch that every time it's on, and I laugh just as hard every time, even though it's really stupid. Nonfiction though, I have the Bletchley Park book on my to be read mountain. I haven't read that one yet. And I have another book that I cannot remember the name of to save my life, but it's about Hitler and his obsession with art and the occult and things like that. And Suze, if you loved Monuments Men, you should go on YouTube and find the Graham Norton show where he had the cast on.
Oh,
You will
boy.
laugh so hard you will hurt.
I'll have to do that.
Because it involves Bill Murray. It's fun.
There's that other movie with Brad Pitt, Allied. Did you guys see that one?
Yes.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, another really great movie.
Well, the books that I've read that have been really interesting, like you all, I don't read World War II when I'm writing World War II in fiction because I just don't want to have to worry about that osmosis effect. But I read a book called The Last Season, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it's about the London season. As those who read British historical fiction know, that's the height of the social season, court debuts for young women and all that. And it's about the summer of 1939 and the lead up to the war, which was the last, of course, normal season that they had. And then there's one called Gun Button to Fire by Tom Neal, who was one of the most decorated British combat pilots during the war. And I found it down a rabbit hole because I found out there was this thing called the Officers Sunday Club that some upper class women in London organized. And it started out at the Dorchester Hotel, and it was on Sunday afternoons. And the idea was to allow young officers who were in the city to do something, have some companionship with nice young women, have some tea, do a little dancing, and stay out of trouble. So they did this at the Dorchester Hotel. Then they outgrew it, and it moved to the Grosvenor House Hotel. But in the process of, I wanted to use it in my book, and I got obsessive about, well, what did the ballroom look like, and what were the rules, and who could come, and y'all know. So I found this book, a reference to it in Tom Neal's memoir. But by that time, I had found enough stuff that I didn't feel compelled to order this book in order to get like 5 paragraphs out of it. So
Okay, this is my shocked face.
Yeah. I'm sure my husband had kind of a shocked face too. You're actually not ordering a book. But it's called Gun Button to Fire. And apparently on a Spitfire, which is what he flew, there was a button that had to be set to fire before you could shoot. And so I have not read all of it. I kind of skimmed it when it arrived, but it's a memoir of his training as a Spitfire pilot. So if anybody out there is planning to write a Spitfire pilot, you might want to check out this book. And I've ordered a book that I'm really interested in, partly because of my connection to the Philippines. It's called Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. And it's about the sailors on the US Navy destroyers who were holding off the Japanese forces while the Army landed to reinvade the Philippines. So I'm looking forward to reading that one. And I would just like to mention, if anybody out there is doing research into the Second World War or really any military period, you should check out the website for Osprey, OSPREY, like the bird, ospreypublishing.com. They have a wide array of books. They're all very thin. They're kind of squarish trade paperback size, but they're printed on slick paper. They have lots of color plate illustrations. That's where I found out exactly.
They have books on everything.
Everything. That's where I found out exactly what gear my medieval archer in another story would carry, and they had pictures of it. So it's just, if you want to go down a military rabbit hole, go to the Osprey website. I have a bunch of books for World War II. They have huge array of books for World War II. Everything you could possibly want to know about World War II, they probably got a book on it. So that's my plug. And also I have a book I have not yet read, and I can't remember the title of it, but it's about the Polish Air Force in Britain in World War II. I learned about them in a book called Last Hope Island. And Poland apparently had one of the best air forces in Europe. And when Poland fell, a lot of them came to the UK. And that's a whole rabbit hole and a long story, and I'm not going to go into it because we have other things to talk about. But they turned out to be one of the best fighting units in the war when they finally got to go into the air. They're kind of like the Buffalo Soldiers in the Civil War and the Nice troops in the Second World War and the Tuskegee Airmen. It's kind of like, if you want something done well, give it to somebody who's got something to prove. But anyway, we have almost run an hour, and we haven't even talked about the home front yet. So would anybody like to say anything about what interests you about what went on during the home front in the war?
Well, I was fascinated with it because, again, both my parents were from that era. And, you know, for them coming out of the Depression and coming, you know, things were just starting to get better. And then, wow, we're smack in the middle of a war. And, you know, the ideas about rationing and coupon, you know, having the coupons and shortages on butter and sugar and all those different things, and the workarounds that they had, you know, molasses and honey versus, you know, how much, and all of those different things that they did just to keep the war effort going, and how many things went, the steel drives and the metal drives and things, they were just fascinating. What people would bring and turn into scrap metal so they could build battleships. And the fact that some of those battleships are still around is really pretty astonishing.
One thing I thought was very interesting was I talked to my grandmother because she had 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls, and she sent all 3 sons to World War II, 1 to the Pacific, 2 to Europe. And I asked her, you know, what was that like? I mean, because we all know about Saving Private Ryan. And she just completely took it in stride. And she said, well, that's what everybody did. It wasn't talked about. So I kept trying to imagine myself having 5 children and have 3 of them in a war. I mean, they were really a different generation than our own generation. Imagine having children and sending them off to war. So.
Oh, I can beat that. My dad was one of 18.
Oh, good Lord.
He had 6 brothers.
Your grandmother gets stars in her crown for that one.
Yeah, I know. There wasn't much to do in the mountains of Tennessee. And my mother comes from one of 10. And my paternal grandmother, 5 of her sons went to World War II. My dad was the youngest, and the oldest was already married and had a family and was too old to serve. Then there was my mom's brother. She had 4 older brothers and 2 younger brothers and 2 sisters. And several of my aunts on my dad's side, because there was 11 of them, they actually went north into New Jersey and worked in the plants. They
were Rosie the Riveter.
They were Rosie the Riveters. Some of them went into nursing. The 5 guys all came back from World War II. They all survived. And my mom's 3 brothers that went all came home. And so my parents were the younger ones. They were too young to serve. They were teenagers, but they talked a lot about the rationing and how, but they lived on a farm, so they were used to having to do everything themselves, as far as food preparation and storage. So the shortages that were in the cities and the rationing, they didn't get that so much out where they were, because they lived down the farms and they did everything out there.
Well, you know, one of the things I found was interesting was this was the era when stockings still had seams, and they were separate stockings. Pantyhose had not been invented at this point. And because nylons were rationed, people would take eyeliner or eyebrow pencil and draw a line up the backs of their legs so it would still look like, I mean, I would assume you would have to have somebody else do that for you. The ability to twist around and draw a straight line on the back of your leg is kind of like,
Well, your stocking was just
That takes some
crooked.
skill.
it's like really crooked.
Your stocking was just a little crooked that day.
Yeah.
What was worse though, in my book, I actually have a scene where the 2 girls are helping each other out with their stockings. But for Irish and British girls, white legs is a big issue. So what they were using was gravy browning. They'd sponge it
Oh, my
on
word.
first, and then they draw the line down. So you can imagine it smelled lovely.
I got this book from the Imperial War Museum that's a reprint of a book that was issued during the war called Make, Do, and Mend. And it was all about how to adapt one kind of garment into another kind of garment. And then, of course, there were all the ration cookbooks of the period. And a friend of mine in London said, you know, actually during the war, when we were eating a ration diet, and he was not alive at this point, I will hasten to say, I think he's quoting his parents. He said, we were actually healthier because we had a lot less fat in our diets and we weren't overeating. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. And of course, the cookbooks are all very upbeat, and you can make this, and this is great, and this is delicious, and you'll love this. But I also found out that the government had created cafes, and I can't remember what they're called, that for people who were bombed out in the city of London. Well, your ration coupon doesn't do you much good if you don't have any place to cook. And so people could go there and get a meal. And they were actually sponsored by the British government, which I thought was interesting.
Did any of your parents ever carry over a quirk from their time during World War? My dad loved to take, and my mom would do this periodically for him. She would make a cake, like a pound cake. And instead of putting any icing on it, she would just slice it up and then open a can of peaches. And my dad loved to have cake with canned peaches on top of it, because that was the only real that they didn't have enough sugar to make a cake and icing. So when my grandmother would make cakes, then they would take a tin of peaches and open it and put it on top of the cake to kind of sweeten it up a little bit. I thought that was the weirdest quirk, but he loved it.
My mom started drinking her tea because, you know, she grew up in the South and sweet iced tea is the Southern beverage. But she started drinking her tea unsweet during the war because sugar was rationed. And she just never went back to putting sugar in it. Iced tea was always made unsweet at our house so that my mother could have her unsweet tea. And then the rest of us are dumping in sugar, which I'm sure was so good for us. But that was what she carried over.
My mother, she was again in France. She was a child during World War II. And she said she vividly remembers how you got 1 pat of butter per week, and it was put in a bowl floating in water. And you also got 1 tiny square of chocolate. And people showed their affection to one another by giving their ration of butter or chocolate to somebody they cared about.
Anybody else want to add anything to this?
Well, I don't actually know if it's a holdover from the Depression or if it's a holdover from the war years, but my sister and I used to joke that my mother would keep a box full of string, and it was basically string too short to tie. And it was just like little pieces of string. And, you could use it for a fire starter, and she would tell us all these things. And we're like, just light a match. No, you might need it sometimes. So she always had her box of string too short to tie. And I don't know whether that's a holdover from the Depression or from the war, but it was a quirk.
Is there anything anybody else wants to add before we wrap up? Anything else you want to talk about? No? Okay, then. Let's go around and please tell everybody where they can find information about you and your books, and if there's a new or an upcoming release you want to make everybody aware of, please feel free to do that. Suze, you want to start?
I'm at SuzanneFerrell.com, and I'm also Suze Ferrell on Facebook and Twitter. I don't do any of the other ones just simply because I can't figure them out. So I try to stay off of other social medias. I figure those are enough for me. I just released, now I don't have a copy of it because we've moved and I can't find things, but my first book in the series is probably backwards to you guys. It's called Shanghai. And that's the first book in the Neptune 5 series of my Spy Chasers. And
hold that up a little higher. All we saw was your name across the top of the cover.
Well, of course, that's because I like my name big. It's called Shanghai. My cover designer understands I want my name big. Then the second book is called Tracked, and it takes place in North Carolina and involves spies coming to stop the war games that I discovered in a rabbit hole of research that took place in the North Carolinas right before Pearl Harbor in late November. And so I have Patton's Second Army was there, and I've got the new tank divisions, and I have my little codebreaker girl, and it's that beta guy that's the tracker of the group is part of it. So we played a word, we called it Tracked because tanks run on tracks. They're tracking these guys, and my hero is a tracker. So we kind of put all those together for the title. And it leads into them entering the European War theater. So it just came out in October, and so we've got 3 more books planned for that.
Okay, Sophia?
So my last book was Whispering in French, published by HarperCollins. And while that is a traditional woman's fiction, prior to that, I wrote Regency set historical romance for, again, Avon, HarperCollins, and also Penguin Putnam. You can find me at www.sophianash.com. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, Jeannie?
I'm pretty easy to find. You can find me at JeanneAdams.com. You can find me on most social media, primarily Twitter, where I spend way too much time, and here on ConTinual. You can find me here on ConTinual a lot.
Pam?
Well, you can find me at pamlecky.com. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. My last book published was Her Secret War, which is published by HarperCollins and Avon. And the sequel to that, Her Last Betrayal, is up on pre-order. It's coming out in April. And then in my indie series, the 3rd book in my mystery series was published in December. So the World War II books are available pretty much anywhere, most bookstores and online.
And you can find information about me at nancynorthcott.com. I'm on Twitter, where I spend, like Jeannie, probably more time than is good for me. I'm at Nancy Northcott there. I have an Instagram account, but I can sympathize with Suze because I really didn't understand what I was doing when I set it up. And so if you search my name, you can find me, but it's not under my name because I didn't do it right. My last release in the King series was The Steel Rose, which is set during the Napoleonic Wars in the 100 days between Napoleon's escape from Elba and the Battle of Waterloo. The King's Champion, my World War II book, is in production process. We don't have a firm release date yet, but my next release will be science fiction in the series that Jeanne and I write together. It's called The Speaker for All, and it's about a dangerous surprise lurking in the oceans of Outcast Station in the Outcast Station series. And what did you say, Jeanne?
I said, "Wah!"
And that'll be out sometime this spring. So I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for participating in this morning's discussion. Thanks to everybody who watched us, and you can always find us here on ConTinual.